So we sometimes hear people say, we don't have to go to church to find God. And true enough. I mean, we can find God anywhere, right? But what was also true is if you don't find God out there, you're not going to find him in here. So, and I think you and I come here week after week, not so much to find God, but to kind of celebrate our relationship with him. We kind of come here and thank him for the gifts of family and friends and the good moments in our lives, and maybe be with him in the difficult moments of our life. And the stories we heard tonight, terrific stories. That first and third story are both looking for God in the middle of a catastrophe. And that's what we do. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they said it's like, you watch the news day in and day out, and it's like Groundhog Day. It doesn't seem like we're ever going to get through this pandemic. We might be on the early side of it. And this is the catastrophe. This week we had the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima. We saw the explosion in Beirut, huge catastrophes. But we've got personal catastrophes: death, divorce, loneliness, fear, anxiety, unemployment, all kinds of catastrophes personally in our lives. Well, where do you find God in the middle of a catastrophe? Good examples today. So we got the famous Elijah, and the backstory, before you get to that story tonight, the backstory, and you've seen it in the book of Kings. Elijah is fresh off of his show-stopping victory against the pagan prophets, and the contest where they're in the desert. Queen Jezebel, who came over from Jordan, Israel's neighbor to the east, and she marries King Ahab, the Jewish king. So now they're running Israel, and she brings with her all of her pagan prophets, and she wants to show the superiority of her prophets. And they're out in the desert, and they decide to have a bake-off, and they're going to sacrifice these animals on a brazier, but they've got to ask their gods to light the fire. So Elijah looks at the 400 prophets of Baal, the pagan god, and he says, "You guys go first." So the 400 guys, they danced around, they chanted, they did everything they could, and then Elijah was needling them. Look it up, read Book of Kings tonight, and he says, "Sing louder." Maybe he went out for a cup of coffee. Maybe your God's in the bathroom and can't hear you. So he had some fun with it. Then he said, "Well, my turn." And he said, "Pour some water on it." And they poured water on it, and then he prayed to Yahweh God to strike it, and boom, it was immolated. The sacrifice happened. And the earth opens up, and the pagan prophets all go in, and they're done. They're gone. Huge victory. Jezebel's not happy. She sends her henchmen to get Elijah, and they're going to kill him. And so they chase him out, and he's in the desert again, and he's heading south in Israel, and he sits down, and he's contemplating his miserable life. He says, I've lost my status as a prophet. I wonder if my ministry was worthwhile. And he's contemplating suicide when an angel of God appears to him. They share a meal. He feels a little bit better. He trudges on down, and he reaches Mount Horeb, which is where we pick up the story here today, and that first story tonight. And Mount Horeb, its other name is Mount Sinai. And if you're a good Jew, that's where Moses, all the fireworks happened on top of the mountain with Moses. That's where all the revelations happened. And Elijah goes up, and he asks God for a sign to reveal himself. And God says, "Well, I'll reveal myself. Go down and step out the entrance of your cave, and I'll come by." Well, Elijah probably can you imagine how excited he must have been? He's right there with his hero Moses. The divine fireworks are about ready to happen. And he goes outside, and there's volcano, there's an earthquake, there's giant wind, there's fire. No God. And then you heard that story tonight, that tiny whispering voice. and he knew that God was revealing himself. And then what did he do? He threw his cloak over his head and he walked away. God was speaking to him in his innermost being, which is kind of where you and I find God when we create that space and we get quiet enough. He didn't have to go up in the mountain to hear that, to discern that. He didn't have to do that. God was with him all along. He had never abandoned him. So Elijah goes off and he's filled with new vigor to continue his ministry. Powerful. The gospel story, the storm at sea, is almost the polar opposite of what happened with Elijah. So they're out there, giant storm, and the divine fireworks are happening. The ones that Elijah was looking for were happening, and the only issue is, in the middle of this catastrophe, the apostles didn't recognize Jesus. They didn't recognize Jesus because they didn't recognize him in the quiet, in the stillness first. They didn't do their homework. So, and that's, we always think that God should operate on our terms. Elijah had to learn probably not to compete with Moses, and clearly the apostles had to learn the lesson of Elijah to first recognize God in the silence. So when the big catastrophes come, they're all set. They've got this relationship. They know had this innermost voice in them, and they know that God speaks to them here. And that's the challenge for you and I in a culture that is so noisy and that it pushes this quiet moment, our innermost space, to the side and to the back burner. We need an army of Elijahs to help us discern the voice of God in our time.